they had radio transmission recordings of the flight group in which one of the Rafales was shot down. And amusingly, the call sign for the whole group was GODZILLA. So I think you had the flight leader, GODZILLA 4, communicating with GODZILLA 3, saying, GODZILLA 3, are you there? And getting no response. And then GODZILLA 4 reports, maybe back to the ground, explosion in air. So it's basically, if this recording is real, it's literally the flight leader like trying to find his colleague and then seeing a big explosion. Welcome to Manifold. Today I have, once again, TP Huang as our expert guest. The topic today is the India-Pakistan conflict and its implications for Chinese versus Western military technology. And what I'll do now is start by giving a relatively superficial summary of what happened, but then TP and I will dig into it for more detail. Now, I'm going to give the consensus Western media, Western analyst analysis of events. This is heavily contested by the Indian side, or at least Indian netizens on X, on Twitter. So just for my Indian audience, I understand that the summary of what happened that I'm about to give may not be accurate, but we're just going to start with it as a baseline. Also, I'm not going to discuss the politics, who was right, who was wrong. We're going to spend zero time on talking about Islamic extremists. We're just going to talk about a conflict that occurred between two professional armies, and we're going to talk about what we learned about the weapon systems from that conflict. So May 6th, May 7th, the Indian Air Force launched an attack across the border into Pakistan at certain sites that they said were operating locations for Islamic terrorists. The Pakistan Air Force was aware or became aware of the activities of the Indians very early on through long-range sensing. They scrambled their fighter jets. There ensued a roughly 1 hour air battle, which many people say was the first of its kind. So it was the first large-scale air battle, which involved something like 100 plus modern fighter jets, electronic warfare planes, etc., UAVs as well. But the entire conflict took place beyond visual range. So it's probable that none of the pilots ever saw each other. All the attacks were made via long-range sensing, i.e. radar. And the consensus opinion is that in that brief air battle, the Pakistanis shot down at least a few modern jet fighters from the Indian Air Force, including at least one Rafale, which is a French-made plane from Dassault, which is reputed to be one of the best non-fifth generation or 4.5 plus generation fighter jets in the world. The Indians paid a lot of money for these Rafales, reportedly something like $300 million. The Pakistanis were mainly operating Chinese hardware in the form of J-10Cs, which are a single-engine fighter that they purchased from China, and JF-17s, which are jointly produced single-engine fighter that the Pakistanis and the Chinese collaborate to make. The media has reported this as a J-10C kill of at least one Rafale, probably also a MiG-29, perhaps a Mirage 2000, and perhaps also, I forgot what it was, an SU something. So let's just stop there and let me go to TP Huang, and he can add a little more color and expertise to what I just said.
Hi, Steve. I'm glad to be back. And I think this is one of the most interesting things we've seen in the military blogs here for a long time, because very rarely do you get like these humongous battles where over 100 aircraft are involved. And by military standards, these are also fairly modern air forces. So you're not talking about something like the Russian versus Ukraine, where the Russians are clearly supposedly a much more capable air force than the Ukrainians, or something between Armenians and Azerbaijan, which are just like very small air forces. On paper, I would say before this, I think it was very even in terms of technology-wise. The two air forces were considered to be relatively even, but the Indian air forces were bigger, but the Indian air force also has to deal with, I guess, a two-front battle, because they can't fully devote all their military resources to Pakistan, because they also have to deal with China on the other side. It was a very interesting setup for a lot of the, I guess, the aviation geeks out there. And the interesting thing is, back in 2019, they had fought over the air when last time this happened. And it was very famous because the Pakistani claimed that they shot down 3 Indian aircraft, and the Indians claimed they shot down 1 Pakistani aircraft, if I can remember correctly. But the most interesting part about that is the Indians had one of their planes shot down in Pakistan. So the Pakistanis actually captured one of the Indian pilots. So this was obvious that they, very conclusive, they actually shot down the Indian Air Force aircraft. And so this was a very humiliating moment for the Indian Air Force. And since that time, I would say that you had a case where both air forces in this most recent conflict were very conservative. They didn't want to get in a situation where one of their pilots could get captured. So you see that in the actual battlefield, the report that we read, all the aircraft actually stayed within their own boundaries. So the net result of that is the actual battles had to happen at a longer distance away, because if both sides stayed at least 50 kilometers within their own border, then, at minimum, the engagement zones are probably like 30 to 40 kilometers, which is the beyond visual range. And there just really haven't been that many BVR kills in modern history, just for the fact that, for the most part, when it's between the NATO air forces and like a lesser air force, the NATO air force normally has such a commanding dominance over the battlefield that they're able to have complete overview of what's going on and get a little closer before before they feel the need to like be 100% sure and shoot down the opposing aircraft. So whereas in this case, you had a more even matchup, and neither air forces were willing to get too close to the border. Any battle had to happen from a much further distance out. And the great thing about that is, due to the longer distance at which they operate, we really got to see what the current generation, what beyond visual range air battle should look like, or at least how we think it should look like. I think that's for a starting point, that's where we were at the start of May 7th. And
let's like go to the second part of the conflict. Let's just stick to the air battle for a second. And so let me just say that the 2 missiles that were probably involved were the PL-15, which is a Chinese missile, and the Meteor on the Rafale, which is a European missile. And one of the key issues here is, does one of them outrange the other? Some people report that at least the Chinese version of the PL-15 has a range of something like 300 kilometers, could potentially shoot down an opponent from 300 kilometers away. I think the Meteor range is somewhat less. And then the second issue is how well networked those missiles are. In other words, how do they find their target? Are they getting the targeting information from the radar on the fighter jet that shoots the missile, or from an AWACS plane, which is somewhere else? Or is it using its own internal radar on the missile? Why don't you just comment on that set of topics?
Yeah, so I think it's important to just talk about the entire battlefield, what air forces use to actually track down the other side and such. A lot of these concepts I've heard from basically people who know this stuff a lot better than I do talk about this. I'll just try to do a layman version of it, and hopefully I don't offend too many people saying this guy's a moron along the way. My understanding is just generally at a very high level, the modern battlefield, right? It's very obvious that you need to first find the other side in order to shoot them down. And then you don't want them to find you. So that's why we moved to stealth. The stealth has become such an important part of newer generation aircraft, like fifth generation is a lot stealthier than fourth generation, and sixth is going to be a lot more stealthy than the fifth generation. There's also a lot of investment being put into different kind of radars and sensors to actually track, and using more modern like computation and algos to actually find out the harder to discover flying objects in the air. One of the things that people don't really think about when they talk about air battle is what I call electronic emissions. So whenever you do any kind of communication, whether it's like turning on your radar where you're sending radar pulses out, whether it's data linking, so you're communicating with other aircraft in your Air Force, or you're talking with satellites, or you're just talking with the missiles that you're sending out, all these things require electronic transmissions along the way. Whenever you have electronic transmissions, there's things that can happen. Obviously, one, they could be interrupted, right? If there's very strong electronic magnetic pulses along the way, it could get disrupted. You could have a thing where people detect the radar pulses or the communication waves that you're sending out, and then have an idea of where you are. And then there's also the cases where, I don't know if this happens or not, but like maybe they can spoof your presence along the way. But electronic warfare and this entire emissions is a huge part of modern warfare, to the best of my knowledge.
Yes. Let me just add one thing I forgot to say. So I mentioned that what are the different sources of radar location of the enemy here? I mentioned AWACS planes, the radars on the fighters, and then also the final targeting radars that are on the missiles. But I didn't mention the ground radar. So another issue here is that these are neighboring countries. They have ground radar that have been observing the takeoffs and landings of all the planes of their opponent for many years. And so it could literally be that the ground radar knows where all the enemy planes are. And just if your data links are right, it can communicate that to the fighter jet or to the missile itself. Sorry to interrupt. Go on.
Yeah, so what's kind of interesting about if you believe the Pakistani side of things, is everything makes a lot of sense if you actually look at the Pakistani side of things. So this is why I personally think the Pakistani story was not too far from the truth. So one of the things that I had been trying to figure out for the longest time was, before they did their presentation, was because one of the wreckage that people posted online of Rafale was from at least like 70 kilometers within the Indian border. So that meant the aircraft was probably shot down from well over 100 kilometers away. And this kind of kills just is so difficult to consider, because first you actually have to pick up the Rafale from really far out, and then you have to actually get some kind of start tracking it a little bit, and then you have to probably have something that can establish weapon grade resolution tracking on the Rafale. And finally, the missile itself has to actually lock onto the Rafale. Once a missile goes like 100 kilometers, it runs out a lot of energy. The question I had in my head was like, how is it possible that a modern 4.5 generation aircraft with very modern radar warning systems and electronic warfare suite and can turn pretty well get killed from this far out? So one of the interesting things is that the Pakistanis were basically telling us exactly when the Indian aircraft was taking off from the air and which air bases they were leaving from, and also how many aircrafts were taking off, which tells me a few things. One, they had pretty good access to the Chinese satellites. They're very close allies to China. As you may know, right now globally, really only America and China has this ISR constellations in the air. So as a close ally that buys mostly Chinese weapons, Pakistan would most likely get pretty high access to the Chinese ISR constellations. So they would have a good idea of when the aircraft themselves take off from the runways. And there's also like a huge radar station in southern Tibet that can look into India. If you have an aircraft that takes off 300 kilometers within India's own border, then it is probably going to be 600 kilometers or 500 kilometers from the AWACS and the ground-based radars. And it's probably going to be at least 400 kilometers away from the fighter jets. So those are a kind of distance you wouldn't think can actually track just based on the geography and the mountainous regions and whatever. So I think it's pretty high likelihood that one, they got tipped off where the aircraft were taking from, and two, there's these electronic intelligence satellites in the air from China that was used to actually further pick up the general direction of the Indian aircraft. And then you also had the Chinese radar system in southern Tibet that I think probably also picked up on the Indian radar, because the southern Tibet radar was like very high on the mountain, so it can see further away. There's nothing blocking it.
Yeah, so this specific aspect to the story has, I think, gone very hot in the last couple of days, especially in Indian media, where they are now like claiming that a very big part of the Pakistani success came from active assistance from the Chinese side. I don't know, everything you said is plausible. I just don't know how true or not true it is. It's certainly, I think the incentive is definitely there for the Chinese to do this because they support the Pakistani side. And secondly, if the air battle turns out to be a big victory for the Pakistanis using Chinese weapons, it's a huge PR victory for China. So yeah, I wouldn't put it past them to have assisted in such an active way.
I think in general, right, like it's pretty well known that China at least at minimum provides commercial grade satellite guidance to the Russians, and quite possibly the U.S. military is accusing China of also providing commercial grade satellite imaging to the Houthis and maybe not the Houthis, but the Iranians. I think there's a pretty good chance that, like, as anytime you buy weapons from China or U.S., you are given the full package, right? You're not just getting the aircraft and the aircraft themselves, but you're getting the entire combat system. You're getting the operational controls. You're getting their access to the satellites. You get to train on how China or U.S. use these systems. So I think this is part of the story. And whether or not this was Pakistani against India, or like if China had sold this to Egypt or something like that, then I think you would be supplying this regardless. But I think what I'm trying to get to is that it was very interesting because Indian aircraft did not appear to have a good knowledge of where the Pakistanis were based on what I was looking at. And the Pakistanis seemed to be very aware of how many Indian aircraft there were, because they were saying 72 plus, and the Indian Air Force said there were a total of 80 aircraft that they scrambled. So that's, if you have 72, if you're that close, if the Pakistanis had that good view of where the Indians were coming from, then India was doing a pretty poor job of actually hiding their assets.
Right. So I don't have a high confidence opinion on how crucial Chinese radar and satellite coverage were to the Pakistani performance, but it's definitely possible it was very crucial. The story, I think, which at least as of the briefing on the first day after the battle by I think it was the Vice Air Marshal of Pakistan, which I highly recommend. I'll put a link in the show notes to that briefing, because I think all sides maybe during conflict are using propaganda and disinformation. So you should take everything with a grain of salt. But he seemed quite credible to me, and what he said seemed quite plausible. So at least as of that time, the impression I got was something more like using ground radar and AWACS, and with the J-10s and J-17s keeping their radars off, so they were harder to detect, they were nevertheless able to track the Indian planes and launch the missiles using the tracking information, which came not from the fighter jets themselves, but from other sources. And then the missile itself can receive, the PL-15 can receive mid-course guidance, so it can get itself pretty close to the target fighter jet before it turns on its own radar for final target acquisition. And so that was the picture I had as of that first briefing. Do you think that's still consistent with how it was done?
Yes. And what we saw is, and I don't want to offend too many Indian military supporters out there, so this is just my view based on what I think happened and the Pakistani reports on some of this stuff. And it checked out to me just thinking about things a little bit, is that the Pakistani seem to understand, Air Force seem to understand pretty well that you need to keep your, what I called, I said earlier, the electronic emissions down. So that means keep your radar off for the longest period possible, so the other side's radar warning receiver doesn't pick you up. So we have what we call the low probability of intercept modes on these modern aircraft. When they use AESA aircraft, they often use the phrase LPI because to describe the situation where the radar is because they're sending separate pulses are different every time. They're harder to pick up. Rafale has the LPI radar, and the modern Block 3 JF-17s and also the J-10s were all using LPI radars. But even so, I think it's just based on the training that the Pakistani had with the Chinese Air Force and how PLA Air Force was actually fighting. The Pakistanis understand that the LPI part of it is not absolute, right? You still should keep your radar off and emissions up as long as possible.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I felt the briefing given by the Vice Air Marshal was credible is because these militaries, as you said, Pakistan and the PLA Air Force have trained together a lot. And the specific tactics and the design of the weapon systems from the PLA are public. So they tell you things like, yeah, we have a missile that can get its targeting information from a networked system, right? And all this is public. These are features of the missile, and they sell an export version of the PL-15. These are all features of the technology that people have been talking about for many years. And if you're an actual analyst, military analyst, this is how you theorize that BVR warfare is actually going to go down. And so when the Pakistan guy was briefing it, I was like, this is just going down the way that it's designed to go down. And on the other side, a lot of the people on the sort of pro-Indian side who didn't want to accept that this actually happened didn't seem to be aware that this is literally how most people who think seriously about air warfare think the next generation of air war is going to be conducted.
Yeah, I think it's based on what I know about how air warfare is. So when I wrote about this concept of H, this is what they call, the Chinese Air Force calls Asset A track, Asset B launches, and Asset C guides it. So basically you have ground radar or you're initially tracking the enemy aircraft, and then you have your J-10 launching the missile, and then you have the AWACS guiding the missile to the target. And depending on how good you think PL-15 is, it may or may not be able to fit the targets without fighter jet radar also turning on the radar at the end. So basically the AWACS radar resolution is going to be lower than your typical fighter jet radar resolution, but you can see things from further out. So if it's not good enough, that at some point the fighter jet itself needs to get a little closer to the enemy aircraft and turn on its own radar to guide the missile for maybe guide it until it gets to 5 to 10 kilometers, maybe 10 kilometers of a more modern aircraft that's a little stealthy like Rafale before the PL-15 can actually lock onto the Rafale in this case.
Yeah, as an algorithm, you just say you have some assets A, B, C, D, E, right? So the algorithm, if it's all networked and the amount of information that has to be exchanged is relatively modest, because I'm just telling the missile what the position velocity of the target is at any given moment. It's not a lot of bits, right? So the algorithm would be like, oh, the asset which is furthest away, but can still measure X and V enough of the target, does it and transmits to the missile, but then you pass it off if the AWACS can no longer get granular enough measurement of those quantities, and it passes it off, and the fighter has to turn on its radar. And then in the final phase, the missile itself turns on its radar, but not until the last minute, so that the fighter jet maybe doesn't even know it's been targeted. It maybe doesn't see the missile because the missile is pretty low radar cross section itself. And so that like the way you would do this seems like just algorithmically pretty straightforward. And so to me, like hearing the Pakistanis brief this, they weren't saying anything other than what you already thought was going to be the standard procedure for how to conduct this kind of air battle.
Yeah, so that's the entire thing that was interesting about how it played out. It very much felt like Pakistan was fighting like a modern air warfare, whereas India was not in this case. Because what Pakistan was doing was what you think from beyond visual range should work out in the 21st century. Whereas if Indian was fighting the way I think it should have been fighting, then I would have expected very heavy electronic warfare pressure on the missiles that are coming in. I would expect that they would be able to somehow disrupt the data linking a little bit with the missile and the aircraft, disrupt this kill chain a little bit, and possibly I would also expect that they can pick up that they got locked. The aircraft itself could pick up that it got locked down by the opposing radar at a much earlier point. If you actually listen to the recordings, if the Pakistanis were actually able to record the Indian Air Force pilots talking to each other, that's actually quite embarrassing. And if that's actually the real recordings, then what it tells us is that the Rafale pilots did not even see the missile coming. They just suddenly lost contact with the pilot.
Oh, just to comment on that. So at the press conference, which I encourage anybody who's really into this stuff to listen to, they had radio transmission recordings of the flight group in which one of the Rafales was shot down. And amusingly, the call sign for the whole group was GODZILLA. So I think you had the flight leader, GODZILLA 4, communicating with GODZILLA 3, saying, GODZILLA 3, are you there? And getting no response. And then GODZILLA 4 reports, maybe back to the ground, explosion in air. So it's basically, if this recording is real, it's literally the flight leader, like trying to find his colleague and notice, and then seeing a big explosion. And they somehow managed to capture this radio transmission and I guess decrypt it somehow. I don't know whether these are normally encrypted or not. They should be.
They should be encrypted, but in 2019, the Pakistani also were able to capture communications between the Indian pilots. Apparently, the 5 years, the Indian Air Force did not improve in that area in the last 5 years.
Yeah. Now, the Indian side immediately just said, these are just fake. This never happened. And so but I'm not sure. Wouldn't be that surprised if there really was a squadron called GODZILLA and GODZILLA 3 got shot out of the air.
It kind of passes a smell test, at least on some aspect, that the Rafale didn't spot the incoming missile or didn't spot it until it gets late. Because if you get shot down from that far out, so PL-15 is what we call a two-stage missile. The first stage it goes and at a certain point slows down a little bit as it gets close to the target. Then it goes into its second stage. And then it can pick up the energy again to try to actually strike down the aircraft. But even so, from that far out is still pretty hard. What this would indicate is that it's the PL-15 itself, if you just look at it, it seems to be it's very stealthy, right? Like it's very narrow, very low cross-section in the front, so it's pretty hard for the radars to pick up. And I don't think the Rafale radar itself picked up. And it probably also didn't turn on its seeker until the end. Right now, it's the only in-service beyond visual range missile to have its own test seeker. So right. This is its major advantage over everything else. It has a ESA seeker I think is 192 TR MMIC units in there. So it can do the thing where it send out different pulses to try to track down, and it's harder to pick up by the opposing aircraft. So from that perspective, it is harder for the opposing aircraft to actually pick up the missiles coming and actually make movements to get away from that. So when people compare PL-15 to the AMRAAMs, I do think the AMRAAM is at a disadvantage in this just because of the seeker technology alone. And this is also one of the reasons why U.S. Air Force has been investing in this new project, AIM-260.
Right. So I think for the current, the 260 is not deployed yet. And so for the deployed US missiles and the Meteor, I think the PL-15 both has, because it has an actively electronically scanned array, AESA seeker radar system, that gives it an advantage. And then also, I think it outranges both the Meteor and the existing US AIMs. So I think currently it's possible the Chinese side has the advantage in their missiles.
Yeah, I guess it's probably, I would say they're probably comparable in range, but I think it's it has a notable advantage over the AIM 120s. C series at least probably has an advantage over AIM 120D also, if the stated 300 kilometers is actually correct. But I think, in my opinion, the biggest advantage is still having the AESA radar in the front.
Yeah.
And that just makes it so much more capable in terms of tracking the opposing target and then actually not getting easily jammed up.
Yep.
So
in an earlier episode of Manifold, I interviewed a guy called Bharat Karnad, who's a very prominent guy in India. He was actually on the advisory committee for nuclear strategy for India. So he's a senior strategic thinker, military thinker in India, and has written many books on the subject. And although he himself is not an expert on air combat, he of course knows everybody in India. And he even quoted a former air marshal of India in the message that he sent me. And he also posted something on his blog about this. And at least several of the people he communicated with, again, senior military people in India, believe this whole picture that the Indian Air Force was not able to locate the J-10s and JF-17s that were doing the firing. They didn't detect the missiles until it was too late. And actually subsequent to this bad outcome in this first air battle, they basically didn't fly any planes after that.
And I think it was pretty obvious that the Indians did not fly any planes after that. And that's also probably why we didn't see any more shoot downs after that first event. Because if you have a situation where you have, I think at least 3 or 4 got shot down. You get 3 or 4, your aircraft shut down, and you don't even see the other side. That's a very scary moment for the pilots. For the pilots themselves, psychologically speaking, they might feel like 10 or 15 aircraft got shot down because their co-pilots, they didn't see it was not, if you have a case where you saw the other side, and then you shot down 1 or 2 of them, and they shot down 3 or 4 of you, that's one thing. But it felt like if the thing happened the way it did, we think it did, then the gap between the 2 air forces is quite large.
Yeah.
So that's why I find this very plausible.
Yeah, let me comment on this, because I think pro-Indian commentators would just deny everything that we've just been saying. And I just want to point out that this guy Bharat is one of the most nationalistic Indian guys. He's for India. India doesn't have a fully modern hydrogen bomb, and he's all for India getting that. So he's pretty aggressive in terms of what he wants for Indian military modernization. But he's realistic, A, and B, he is very well connected. He spoke to a former air marshal of India, and at least in those circles, they accept this as the picture of what actually happened. So I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, and I think it's whatever you tell your public is one thing, right? It's very important for the military themselves to understand where the failures are and where they need to improve in, right? The worst thing that can happen in this is if the Indian Air Force themselves also, if they realize they had a few aircraft shut down and then they just pretend that nothing happened. Like there would need to be like serious changes in your training, right, and how you acquire, but I don't make the acquisitions.
Internally, because they're professionals, I'm sure that is what they'll have to do. But Modi doesn't want anybody talking about it, doesn't want the media talking about it, doesn't want the average Indian to know that this happened. But let me state an alternative hypothesis, which is that in the original raid that happened the night of May 6th, the Indians telegraphed to the Pakistanis saying, hey, we're actually doing this for like internal political reasons, and we're going to execute a raid. We're not going to attack military targets. We're going to attack, quote, Islamic terror targets, which are actually civilian targets. We're not going to attack your air bases or your planes. And so we just telegraph all that. And maybe the Indians just thought the Paks will let us do this. And they were not expecting the Paks to react so aggressively. And so maybe they weren't really on their ball game that first night. What you said, TP, which is that like they didn't seem to be operating in modern 21st century BVR air tactics. Maybe they weren't, because maybe they thought they had telegraphed to the Paks that we're just going to do this symbolic thing and don't attack us, and then we won't escalate. And maybe that was their mistake. However, I don't think that's plausible, because the fact that they didn't fly any planes after that suggests they really were concerned about the outcome of that first battle. And it wasn't just because of a failure on their own part of not taking all the right steps.
Yeah, that when you were describing the situation, I had the exact same thought in my head, which is that, one, if you're going to hit the other side, and if you're going to send aircraft, which I believe on the Pakistani side, of the Indian Air Force coming over, they were as expected. You had the attacking aircraft and you have the escort, right? Their aircraft have, each aircraft have its own roles, what its missions are. So whenever you have aircraft in the air, even if you didn't expect the other side to respond the way they did, you should still take basic precautions, like how you fight battle, right? There's a talk for professional air pilots that you train the way you want to fight in real war.
Yeah, I don't think it's plausible that. I think you could claim that, Indians were just going to do something symbolic, and there was a tacit understanding this wasn't going to be military on military, and that is why they had a bad outcome on the night of May 6th. I think that's not plausible because of the fact that they didn't fly any planes after that. I think they literally did learn something very negative about the situation from the night of May 6th, and that's why they didn't fly any planes after that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that one. And I think that the fact that the Pakistanis did not take advantage of that situation tells me that the Pakistanis themselves also have a lot to work on.
Yeah. I thought one of the greatest lines of the Pakistani vice air marshal when he gave his briefings was, he said, "We showed restraint. The number of kills could have been much higher." And I think what the Pakistani side has said consistently since then is that we only fired at planes that we saw fire at sites in Pakistan. So of the 70 plus planes that were in the air for the Indian Air Force, only a subset fired at ground targets in Pakistan. And the Pakistani claim is they only fired at those planes. They didn't fire at all 70 planes that were in the air. In his words, we showed restraint.
And, normally I'd hate to see what the next Indian-Pakistani conflict will look like, because the stakes have already been raised in this one. Normally, in the previous conflicts, normally you have one side shoot some missiles, lob some missiles over on some irrelevant target. Then you see the counterstrike a couple days later, right? And this was already so much nastier than what we previously expected.
Yeah, the stuff that happened in the last year or two in the Middle East is mostly people not really going for the jugular, I'm going to telegraph that I'm going to fire some missiles at this base, but then we don't need to escalate. If you're okay, then I'm okay. There's a lot of that kind of diplomacy. I don't see it here because we haven't talked about what happened after the air battle. We can get to that in a second. But yeah, basically, it's a very bad situation because the Indians are telling their public that they actually won this overall conflict, and the Pakistani side is telling its public that they won. So that means that the next time something happens, all hell could break loose.
Yeah. And I think the next time this happens, we would not have this, things will look a lot different than the way they played out this time. If Indian Air Force know that they have a disadvantage in the air battle, I think they're just going to attack the air bases in phase one.
They could go immediately to that, and then there could be nuclear weapons at some of those air bases. It's very dangerous. So
yeah,
before we generalize, let me drill down on something. So to get to the real system on system stuff, okay? So let's assume a Rafale really did get shot down. And let's assume a Rafale got shot down from long range, let's say well over 100 kilometers away, by a PL-15. I think most people believe that, other than some online Indian commentators. I think everybody else in the world thinks that's true. So let's think about what this means. So it doesn't tell you about the dogfighting capability of the J-10 or the JF-17 or whatever, but it tells you something about the networked information environment of that PL-15 missile and the quality of its final seeker and of the ability of the Rafale radar system and electronic warfare system called Spectra to detect and jam that missile on its way in. And so I think there are some very granular things that, like this piece of the story, which again, like we don't know for sure if it's true, but most people believe it's true. If that's true, it does tell us some very granular things. A generation 4.5 plus, very expensive European-made jet was shot down from well over 100 kilometers by a PL-15. It might have even been an export version of the PL-15.
First of all, I would say the Rafale itself is, in my opinion, a pretty respectable aircraft. A lot of the Western analysts thought that Rafale in their mind, was significantly better than J-10C before this happened. I never thought that because, like I was looking at the basic stuff like the radar systems and electronic warfare and things like that. And I just knew the Chinese system was probably better because they were using gallium nitride TR modules. That China is the world's leader in telecom and the French are not. But like a lot of people have like archaic views of these things, so they don't understand that. So for me, they were like very comparable, and I thought J-10 had a slight edge in the beginning. But I think what we saw actually is that the system really matters, and the doctrine, the tactics really matters in beyond visual range. Prior to this battle, like the French were very good at marketing their system, saying that Rafale's never been lost in battlefield, and this is almost as good as a fifth generation aircraft because we have the Spectra system.
The Spectra system always struck me as just plain marketing BS, having spent plenty of time in the tech world, right? So the best thing you can market, say you're selling like internet security software, you can just say whatever you want about your product because nobody ever gets to actually test it under real conditions. And so saying, oh, we have the best electronic warfare suite. The Spectra system will detect the missile coming in and jam it. It will never hit you. It's like, well, how often are you really going to face a world-class missile coming in at you? This is the first time, right? And apparently it didn't work.
Yeah, and I think that's to the detriment of the French. And this really shows systems really matter. So having your own satellite network that you can provide to the others, being able to sell your AWACS, that they're willing to work to do the data linking, having your own missiles that are full range of missiles, and having your own electronic warfare aircraft. I think the Pakistani got help from China in converting one of the AWACS into an electronic warfare aircraft. I think all these things really matter when you're doing systems. We know from the discussions that I heard on the Chinese side that the Pakistanis and the PLA really practiced kill chain and things like that. Basically, what I didn't understand before this most recent combat was actually the Pakistanis were actually not particularly good at beyond visual range. And then they went up against some of these exercises against PLA, and basically PLA wiped the floors on them. And then they shared ideas. Obviously, like the Pakistani also helped the PLA on the stuff that they learned, but there was a lot of things that Pakistani Air Force wasn't able to experience.
Yeah, you're talking about annual training exercises that have been happening for many years. And people familiar with that stuff would just not be surprised by the description of the battle because the battle happened the way these guys actually train because they think that's how 21st century air combat works.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that Indians actually got the full training that they need. And I don't want to be mean about that, but like a lot of times when you're training with U.S. Air Force and you're not the closest ally, right? U.S. Air Force is not going to show you their best tactics. Right. They're not going to show all the secret, whereas Pakistanis and the Chinese are very close. So when the Pakistani come to train with China, and the Pakistanis, we want to experience what electronic warfare looks like because we experienced this in like a recent exercise with the Turkish Air Force and the U.S. Air Force. We think we can we can do better against you this time. And then they get into these simulations with the Chinese Air Force, and they can't even get a lock onto J-16 for a couple of days because they just never experienced that level of electronic warfare and the kill chain.
So this issue about the quality of electronic warfare, again, this is a highly technical thing, and you're only going to know how well your technology works against the other side under real battlefield situation, because people aren't going to show you their best stuff, right? So if I'm shopping, I'm a country, unaligned country, and I'm shopping for a fighter jet, they're going to let my pilots fly it. So I'll know whether it has particular aerodynamic characteristics or this much thrust or max speed or climbing capability. Those things are easy to validate. How will I know whether the Spectra EW system really does foil Chinese missiles? I'm not going to find that out until India and Pakistan have a battle, right? And so we did find that out, I believe.
Yeah, and it made a lot of sense to me that the Spectra was entirely overrated in this case, because if you think about it, this was probably the development probably started at least 10 years ago on the system.
Yeah, before ACE seekers were to be found in missiles.
Yeah, the Europeans, the Rafales used like a gallium arsenide trans-TR modules on their aircraft, and technology-wise, it just seems to me like at least half a generation behind what the J-10C uses.
Yeah.
So from that point of view, I think it was always weird to me that a lot of the military analysts thought that the Rafale had this major advantage on radar system.
Most people who are, quote, military analysts, I can guarantee you do not understand any physics. And so, like, the difference between gallium nitride and gallium arsenic, they don't know the difference. What is the difference? Or they don't know after 10 years how much better is the signal processing, the chipset, or the algorithms used by one side versus the other. Like, they have no concept of how these things work. And whereas if you tell me, like, oh yeah, one side has more powerful active electronically scanned array radars, and they have much more modern chipsets and algorithms because their systems are 10, 20 years newer than the other side. Like, for sure, I can imagine big disparities in performance.
Yeah, and also it makes me wonder if like most of the Western air forces are falling behind in doctrine, because you would think that the Indians have been training with some of the NATO air forces, and the Pakistanis would have experienced some of this too, training with some of the NATO air forces. So it makes me wonder, are the NATO air forces just not showing up any of their tactics, like Americans are not sharing with obviously the French, or the French maybe are not sharing the best when they train with the Indians? That like some of these basic things, like don't turn on your radar until
beyond sharing best practices, I just question whether even the Americans, when's the last time an American fighter jet had to face a peer adversary?
Oh, actually, this is a good question I can answer. Actually, the PLA and the U.S. Air Force, they face off against each other regularly on the East China Sea. And you don't read about it because there's no actual battle going on. But emission control, from what I hear, is a very huge issue for both.
Sure, but I've never heard the U.S. Air Force say things like, oh, we have a electronic warfare system on the F-35 so that if the PL-15 is trying to lock on and close the final 10 kilometers, we'll just blind it, or blah, blah, blah. I've never heard claims like that. And secondly, like, how would you know? Because no PL-15 has ever been fired in anger at a U.S. jet. So the whole thing is what anybody says is not necessarily credible until the actual combat happens.
So I think this is very important to know. And like the U.S. Air Force really, I think, has a lot of classified stuff on the electronic warfare systems, right? And these things are not being shared with the regular public, I think.
Right.
And I think it's, yeah.
You can imagine there's some spy stuff or maybe some secret observation of, oh, how does the seeker on the PL-15 work, or what's its electromagnetic signature? You can imagine the Americans have some stuff like that, and then we design some EW countermeasures on our jets and et cetera. But when the French boast about this and they say, oh, but Spectra EW, so you should pay $300 million per Rafale, that's got to be bullshit. Like, how does the French government know that Spectre EW is viable at all against a PL-15. They have no idea.
Yeah, I think the French right now are probably telling the Indians don't fly Rafale for a while because you're damaging our sales prospects.
Yeah, so I think that part but like sorry, I'm getting on one of my hobby horses, but if you read like debates between military analysts who have political science degrees and no physics or engineering degrees, like just the reasoning is faulty. Like I don't see a scenario where the Dassault really knows how well its Spectre EW system works against state-of-the-art missiles. I just don't think they know. And of course, they're going to lie and market it to you as if it works. It's not like antivirus software companies telling you how well their antivirus software works, but they don't really know because I used to be in this industry. They don't really know because they don't know the full threat spectrum until they finally face it. But of course, they're going to market it to you as if it works perfectly.
Yeah, so I think after this, the French are going to lose some sales. I'm pretty sure of that because if you're India at this point, that you really should not order any more Rafales, really, because it's very expensive. And
well, interestingly, Bharat Karnad, and in what he told me and what he wrote on his blog, he said, yeah, there's a group of experts in India. These are very nationalistic military strategists in India, some of them former senior military officials who were like, it was a mistake to buy the Rafale. They just say this explicitly. So they were saying it before this incident happened. It's not a crazy opinion to think that the Indians should not have bought the Rafale.
Yeah, so I think what happened is after 2019, when the Pakistanis shot down and captured our Indian pilots, right? Indians felt like a lot of urgency into getting a more modern aircraft.
That was a MiG-20. Was that a MiG-21?
MiG-21, yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe they felt what the aircraft they had wasn't competitive, or at least wasn't significantly better than what the Pakistani had, and that was not an acceptable situation. And the best aircraft they could get on the market at the time was Rafale, because Su-57s weren't ready, and F-35s probably weren't offered to the Indians at the time.
But I think they overpaid like crazy for their Rafales.
Yeah, and they probably did that because they needed immediate delivery, and because the French ordered Rafales, the Pakistani decided they need to order JCNCs.
Yep.
That's kind of like how we got to here today. I think the interesting thing is that the Americans didn't really even allow the Pakistanis to use their F-16s. So it's pretty much like the Pakistani in this case was just relying on the Chinese system.
Yeah.
Fight amalgamation of Russian and French systems on the Indian side.
Yep. So now we've reached an hour and we spent the whole time on the air battle. After the air battle, basically both sides were just launching drones and missiles at each other. Although there is a claim by the Pakistanis that they damaged maybe the radar of an S-400 air defense system in India. And I believe that was according to the Pakistani side, that was a JF-17 firing a Chinese air-to-ground missile. What do you think about those events?
Yeah, I think if the Pakistani actually had the full air dominance, like basically the Indians weren't flying up at that time, they really did not take advantage of the situation, because if the other side basically is not intercepting your aircraft, at minimum you can fire them from your own side of the border. The fact that if the Pakistanis only had one JF-17 shooting at the S-400, and we don't know if they actually hit the radar unit that they claim, but you would expect there to be more damage if they were actually making a concerted effort to do the ground attacks on the Indian side. So this tells me that either the Pakistanis missed an opportunity, or they were just not confident enough in their ability to penetrate like the Indian air defense protected by the S-400.
Do you think, let me put it this way, do you think we learned anything about the S-400 or the HQ-9? So HQ-9 is the Chinese air defense missile system that the Pakistanis have. Do you think we learned anything about either of those systems from what happened the next day?
I think when it comes to air defense, you're never going to intercept every missile that comes at you, right? So that's why people have the multi-layered defenses. And that's why a lot of it is really also depending on how good your radar is, your operational control, and things like that. Based on the New York Times photos on stuff like this, it does appear like Indians scored more hits on the Pakistani air bases than vice versa. So that would tell me either the Pakistanis decided that they didn't have enough missiles, so they couldn't intercept all the Indian attack missiles coming in, or they were getting overwhelmed by what the Indians were sending over, or the radars themselves, or probably a combination of the radars themselves not fully picking them up.
Yeah, I think the satellite imagery tells us the Indians did more damage than the Pakistanis did to the other side, with the possible exception of this S-400. But I'm not sure what it tells us about the quality or the performance of individual systems.
Yeah, I think when you talk about systems, there's a lot of stuff involved in here. I think that even if you have the best air defense system, but your electronic warfare units are not doing the best job that they could, your radar units are not finding the incoming missiles, maybe your AWACS are not helping out your air defense unit to track incoming missiles, then it makes actually shooting down like a supersonic missile like BrahMos a lot harder.
Yeah.
And we did see that the Pakistanis shot down a whole lot of drones. There were just photos of shot down Indian drones everywhere, but it seemed like they didn't have a great success on shooting down the BrahMos.
Yep. I want to close with an anecdote from an F-4. I think it's an F-4 fighter pilot, American, who was fighting in the Vietnam War. And this is relevant to the quality of systems, air defense, and electronic warfare jamming and stuff like this. So this is a kind of well-known anecdote. This fighter pilot, I think he was flying an F-4 over Vietnam, and the Air Force brass said, we've equipped your plane with the amazing electronic warfare system, so don't worry about the Vietnamese surface-to-air missiles. You'll be able to jam them, or they won't hit you. And from his own experience, this F-4 pilot knew this was all bullshit, right? Because he had seen, I think, some of his comrades shot down by these surface-to-air missiles, despite the quality of the electronic warfare stuff they were told that they had. Okay, so now this guy's on some mission with some huge bombers, like he's flying escort for some huge bombers. And he was then told on this mission, don't worry about the big bombers because they have an even more powerful electronic warfare system than the one on your fighter, on your F-4. And this guy didn't, at the time, he says, I didn't really think that, I knew they were lying about the EW system on my plane because I knew it didn't work. But I just assumed it actually worked for this giant bomber that I was escorting. But then he said, as soon as we started our mission, the North Vietnamese started firing surface-to-air missiles, and I watched this giant bomber crack apart like an egg. That's literally the language that he said, spraying flaming jet fuel through the sky. And I realized, its EW system also didn't work. So this is a fighter pilot for the U.S. Air Force. They lied to him. Why don't they lie to people they're trying to sell the planes to?
Yeah. I could totally believe that. And the Indians probably feeling a little ripped off at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, the electronic warfare, that's such a complex, ethereal thing. I would just never believe what people tell me. It's also system versus system. So it may work perfectly against some primitive old missile from 20 years ago, but it may not do anything to a more modern missile.
Yeah, I think the Indians, they probably are going to come out of this and try to acquire a more modern aircraft where the electronic warfare actually works. In some way, the best choice for them is to get F-35 in terms of capability-wise, but there are other implications that they may or may not be happy to go with.
Yeah.
From that.
But then they're locked into the U.S. complex, and they're captive to if they don't do what the Americans say, the Americans can switch off some systems in the F-35 or cripple their F-35. There are a bunch of reasons why you would want to be careful about buying stuff like that. This guy, Barrett Carnat, that I keep mentioning, whom I had on the podcast already, he's not for India buying F-35s either. So he thinks that's even more of a waste of money than the Rafale. They're in a pretty tough situation, actually.
Yeah, so I think the Indians actually have a pretty tough situation right now. And in the future, I would think that the two main line of system that you're getting is either the Chinese one or the American one. And the Chinese one, obviously, they're not going to get. And the American one, it comes with political questions that they may not want to attach themselves to either. So this is a delicate question for them.
Yep. All right. Any final comments you want to make about stuff that happened between India and Pakistan?
Yeah, I would say that It will be really interesting for me to see what the Indians do after this. It will tell us a lot about what they learn about this experience, because I don't think they could order any more Rafales for the Air Force after this. Maybe the Navy could, but not the Air Force. And so the choices are basically the Russian Su-57s or the American F-35s. It is a very tough question of what's going to be good enough for them, because whatever they get is likely to match up against the Chinese J-35A, which is probably going to be sold to Pakistan sometime later this decade. I think the Indians have a lot of resource advantage. Military successes is not purely based on your economic size.
Yeah. Just for the audience, so the J-10C, which is the most advanced fighter that Pakistan has and is believed to be responsible for the Rafale kill, that's not even the leading edge fighter. It's actually 2 generations in a way behind the leading edge fighter in China. And I believe TP would know the answer to this. I believe that Chinese are no longer buying more J-10Cs for their own Air Force. They're only making J-20s, which is a more advanced 5th generation stealth fighter. And they're exporting J-10s, but they don't actually acquire more J-10s for their Air Force.
Yeah, they haven't for a while because it's too short range for them. Once they got J-20s ramped up and J-16s, they just don't need the J-10C, more J-10Cs anymore. And they're probably going to go with just J-20s and J-35As in the near future. Okay. And then probably a lot of drones.
So the plane itself that may have, quote, caused a deep-seek shock in military technology is not even a plane that's considered the front line, what the Chinese are acquiring right now. It's only for export now. The missile may have been a state-of-the-art PL-15. We don't know for sure.
Nah, that's getting overridden too. They have a new version of the PL-15 that's going to be a little better seeker-wise. It's going to be longer range, and it can fit better inside the stealth aircraft.
Okay, but at this moment in time, it's possible that the Pakistanis did have the same PL-15 that's deployed by the Chinese military right now.
It is possible, theoretically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know for sure.
Yep. Okay, thanks a lot for joining me. I hope the audience enjoyed it. If you are truly interested in the military technology competition between China and the United States, this was a very key new set of data to update on.
Yeah, this was really interesting for all the air nerds.